The morning of February 19th, 1944, broke gray and humid over Piva Yoke airfield on Bougainville Island. Aviation machinist mate first-class Danny Kowalski wiped sweat from his forehead as he completed the pre-flight inspection of F4U-1A Corsair number 17684, the bent-wing fighter that bore the white numerals 29 on its dark blue fuselage and the distinctive skull and crossbones insignia of VF-17 Jolly Rogers. Kowalski had been maintaining Navy fighters since 1940, but the Corsair represented something special. The massive Pratt and Whitney R 2800 double Wasp engine produced over 2,000 horsepower, more than any fighter in the Pacific. Its inverted gull wings and 13-foot propeller gave it an unmistakable profile that struck fear into Japanese pilots throughout the Solomon Islands. But today, Kowalski sensed something different in the air, a tension that made his experienced hands work more carefully over every component. "She's ready to go, Mr. Kepford," Kowalski called out as Lieutenant Junior Grade Ira Cassius Kepford approached the aircraft. The young pilot from Northwestern University had already established himself as VF-17's leading ace with 13 confirmed kills, but his easy smile and Midwestern manner belied the killer instinct that made him deadly in aerial combat. Kepford nodded his appreciation as he conducted his own walk-around inspection. The F4U-1A had served him well through months of combat over the Solomons, its .650 caliber machine guns and robust construction proving superior to anything the Japanese could field. The aircraft bore the scars of numerous engagements, bullet holes patched with aluminum plates and paint touch-ups that spoke to its combat history. "Weather looks like hell," observed Aviation radioman second-class Mike Rodriguez, as he monitored the radio frequencies from the communications tent. Rodriguez had served with VF-17 since their deployment to the Pacific, coordinating the complex dance of takeoffs, landings, and mission updates that kept the squadron operational. His trained ear could read the subtle inflections in pilots' voices that revealed stress, fatigue, or impending danger. The mission briefing had been routine. Escort TBF Avenger torpedo bombers on a strike against Japanese positions near Cape St. George, providing high cover against enemy fighters that might attempt to intercept the slow, vulnerable bombers. The Jolly Rogers would fly in 2 divisions, with Kepford leading the high cover element while other Corsairs provided close escort for the Avengers. Lieutenant Commander Tommy Blackburn, the squadron's commanding officer, reviewed the tactical situation one final time. Blackburn had molded VF-17 into the most successful Navy fighter squadron in the Pacific, but the relentless pace of operations was taking its toll on both men and machines. Intelligence reports indicated increased Japanese fighter activity around Rabaul, suggesting that enemy commanders were concentrating their remaining aviation assets for desperate defensive operations. "Remember, gentlemen, we stick to the mission profile," Blackburn emphasized during the final briefing. "Escort the bombers, protect them from enemy fighters, and bring everyone home. The Japanese are getting more aggressive as we squeeze their perimeter. Don't take unnecessary risks." But Kepford's wingman, Ensign Bobby Miller, experienced engine problems during the pre-flight run-up. The young pilot's Corsair developed a rough idle that could indicate impending engine failure, forcing him to abort the mission. Standard operating procedure called for the entire division to stand down when a wingman was lost, but Kepford volunteered to continue the mission as a singleton, providing high cover for the bombers despite the increased risk of flying alone. Aviation ordnanceman third-class Tony Ricci watched from the ordnance shack as the Corsairs taxied out for takeoff. Ricci had loaded the ammunition belts for Kepford's 6 machine guns, 400 rounds for the inboard weapons and 375 for the outboard guns. The .50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns represented devastating firepower that could destroy any Japanese aircraft with a short burst, but they were useless if the pilot found himself outnumbered and outmaneuvered. "Ike's going up alone," Ricci commented to his supervisor, Chief Petty Officer Frank Sullivan. That's asking for trouble. Sullivan, a career Navy man who had served on carriers since before the war, understood the calculated risks that combat pilots accepted as part of their profession. But flying without a wingman violated the fundamental principles of fighter tactics, leaving even the most skilled pilot vulnerable to surprise attacks and overwhelming odds. The Corsairs took off in formation, their massive radial engines producing the distinctive sound that had earned the aircraft its fearsome reputation among Japanese ground forces. The locals called the base place of death in their native language, but American pilots had turned Piva Yoke into a symbol of Allied air superiority in the Solomons. From this advanced airfield, Navy and Marine squadrons launched daily strikes against Japanese strongholds, gradually wearing down enemy resistance through sustained offensive operations. Executive Officer Lieutenant Commander Roger Hedrick monitored the mission from the Operations Center, tracking the progress of multiple strike groups converging on targets throughout the combat zone. Hedrick had served as Blackburn's right-hand man since VF-17's formation, helping to develop the aggressive tactics that had made the Jolly Rogers the most feared squadron in the Pacific. But the increasing complexity of operations placed enormous demands on squadron commanders who had to balance mission requirements against pilot safety. The strike package proceeded normally as it approached the target area near Cape St. George. The TBF Avengers began their bombing runs while the escort Corsairs maintained defensive formations, scanning the skies for enemy fighters that might threaten the vulnerable bombers. Kepford flew high cover at 16,000 feet, his lone Corsair weaving back and forth to maintain visual contact with the formation below. That was when he spotted the Japanese roof seaplane cruising low over the water, apparently unaware of the American strike in progress. The temptation proved irresistible for an aggressive fighter pilot. Kepford peeled off from his high cover position and dove toward the enemy aircraft, his 6 machine guns converging on the unsuspecting target. A short burst from his .50 caliber weapons sent the roof spinning into the ocean in flames, adding another victory to his growing tally. But the attack had been observed by Japanese spotters, and as Kepford pulled up from his diving attack, enemy fighters began descending from the clouds above. 20 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters materialized out of the overcast, their pilots intent on destroying the lone American fighter that had dared to attack their reconnaissance aircraft. 4 of the Zeros immediately turned toward Kepford while the others maintained altitude, blocking any escape route toward friendly territory. Rodriguez tensed as Kepford's voice crackled over the radio frequencies, the calm professionalism barely masking the desperation of his situation. "Skipper, this is Ike. 3 have me boxed. I am headed north." The transmission lasted only seconds, but it conveyed the full horror of Kepford's predicament. He was alone, outnumbered 20-1, and deep in enemy territory with Japanese fighters converging from all directions. Blackburn's response came immediately, his voice tight with concern for his ace pilot. "Ike, can you break away? We're committed to the bombers." The words carried the weight of command responsibility. Blackburn desperately wanted to help his leading pilot, but abandoning the bomber escort would doom the TBF crews to almost certain destruction. The mission had to continue, leaving Kepford to face the overwhelming odds alone. At Piva Yoke airfield, ground crews gathered around radio speakers as word of Kepford's desperate situation spread throughout the base. Mechanics, ordnance men, radio operators, and support personnel who had maintained his aircraft and tracked his missions suddenly found themselves powerless spectators to a life-or-death struggle playing out hundreds of miles away. The skull and crossbones insignia painted on VF-17's aircraft had become symbols of American air superiority, but now their leading ace faced odds that seemed insurmountable. Kepford's tactical situation deteriorated rapidly as the Japanese fighters closed in. The 4 Zeros that had broken away from the main formation spread out behind him, using superior numbers to box him in and prevent evasive maneuvers. Their pilots flew with the skill and determination of veterans, coordinating their attacks to maximize their numerical advantage while minimizing the Corsair's opportunities to use its speed and firepower. The Zero's legendary maneuverability gave Japanese pilots confidence in close-range dogfights, but Kepford understood that turning with enemy fighters would be suicide. Instead, he pushed his Corsair's throttle forward and activated the War Emergency Power System, a water injection mechanism that boosted the R-2800 engine's output to maximum performance. The massive radial engine responded with a surge of power that pressed Kepford back into his seat as the aircraft accelerated beyond 400 miles per hour. But even the Corsair's superior speed could not immediately overcome the tactical disadvantage of being surrounded by enemy fighters. The Zeros stayed with him through the initial acceleration, their pilots scoring hits on the Corsair's wings and fuselage as they closed to firing range. Kepford felt bullets punching through his aircraft's structure, creating a drumbeat of impacts that threatened to disable critical systems or strike him directly. Chief Sullivan monitored the radio transmissions from the flight line, his weathered face grim as he listened to the distant battle. Sullivan had witnessed hundreds of aerial engagements during his career, but the one-sided nature of this fight struck him as particularly brutal. Japanese pilots were known for their aggressive tactics and willingness to sacrifice themselves for victory, qualities that made them extremely dangerous when they held numerical superiority. The combat continued for what seemed like hours but lasted only minutes as Kepford used every technique in his arsenal to evade the pursuing Zeros. He varied his altitude and airspeed randomly, making it difficult for the Japanese pilots to predict his movements and achieve firing solutions. When one Zero closed to point-blank range, Kepford chopped his throttle and dropped his flaps, causing the enemy fighter to overshoot and giving him a brief opportunity to reverse the situation. The maneuver worked perfectly, allowing Kepford to line up behind the surprised Zero pilot and destroy the aircraft with a concentrated burst from his 6 machine guns. But the victory came at a cost, as the other 3 Zeros immediately converged on his position, forcing him back into defensive maneuvering that slowly carried him deeper into enemy territory and farther from any possibility of assistance. Aviation mechanic second class Jimmy Santos paused in his work on another Corsair as he listened to the radio reports filtering back from the combat zone. Santos had trained on the Corsair's complex systems since the aircraft's introduction to the Pacific theater, developing an intimate knowledge of its capabilities and limitations. He understood better than most that even the most advanced fighter aircraft had limits, and that pilot skill could only overcome numerical odds for so long. The tide of battle began to turn as Kepford's superior aircraft began to assert its advantages over the aging Zeros. The War Emergency Power System gave his Corsair a decisive edge in straight-line speed, allowing him to gradually open the distance between himself and the pursuing Japanese fighters. More importantly, the Corsair's robust construction absorbed battle damage that would have destroyed lighter aircraft, keeping Kepford in the fight despite multiple hits from enemy machine guns and cannon. As the minutes passed, Kepford managed to shoot down 2 more Zeros while avoiding the concentrated fire of the remaining enemy fighters. His ammunition supply was running dangerously low, but the Japanese pilots were becoming more cautious as they witnessed their comrades falling to the lone American fighter. The aggressive confidence that had characterized their initial attack gave way to wary respect for an opponent who refused to be overwhelmed by superior numbers. Radio operator Rodriguez maintained constant communication with other VF-17 flights in the area, coordinating search and rescue efforts in case Kepford was forced to bail out over enemy territory. The complex radio protocols that governed multi-squadron operations required precise timing and clear communication, but Rodriguez's trained professionalism ensured that all relevant units remained informed of the developing situation. The decisive moment came when Kepford spotted a gap in the Japanese formation and committed everything to a high-speed dash toward friendly territory. The remaining Zeros gave chase, but their older engines and heavier aircraft could not match the Corsair's performance when pushed to maximum output. Slowly but steadily, the distance between hunter and hunted began to increase as superior American technology asserted itself over Japanese numbers and tactics. Kepford's engine temperature gauges climbed into the red zone as he maintained war emergency power beyond its recommended time limits, but the massive R-2800 radial continued to produce full power without catastrophic failure. The water injection system that boosted the engine's output had been designed for short-duration emergencies exactly like this one, and Chansvought's engineers had built enough margin into their specifications to handle extreme combat conditions. The pursuing Zeros gradually fell behind as their pilots realized they could not catch the fleeing Corsair. One by one, they broke off the chase and turned back toward their base, their fuel supplies running low after the extended engagement. Kepford had escaped the seemingly impossible situation through a combination of superior aircraft performance, tactical skill, and sheer determination that impressed even his enemies. Back at Piva Yoke, tension mounted as the expected return time for the strike group approached. Ground crews scanned the horizon for approaching aircraft while radio operators maintained constant communication with all elements of the mission. The loss of the squadron's leading ace would represent a devastating blow to both morale and operational capability, particularly given the symbolic importance that Kepford had acquired among pilots and support personnel. Chief Sullivan organized crash rescue teams and medical personnel in preparation for Kepford's return, assuming that his damaged aircraft would require emergency landing procedures. The Corsair's reputation for bringing pilots home despite severe battle damage was well established, but even the most robust aircraft had limits that could be exceeded under extreme conditions. The first sign of Kepford's survival came as a distant speck on the horizon, gradually resolving into the familiar outline of a Corsair with its distinctive inverted gull wings. Ground personnel gathered along the flight line as the aircraft approached for landing, many of them noting the multiple bullet holes and damaged surfaces that testified to the intensity of the aerial battle. Kepford's landing was textbook perfect despite the damage to his aircraft, the massive Corsair touching down smoothly on Piva Yoke's coral runway. As the fighter taxied toward the parking area, cheers erupted from the assembled ground crews who had followed his desperate fight through radio reports and worried speculation. The skull and crossbones insignia on the aircraft's nose seemed to grin with malevolent satisfaction at having cheated death once again. Mechanic Kowalski was among the first to reach the aircraft as Kepford shut down the engine and climbed from the cockpit. The young ace appeared pale and exhausted, his flight suit soaked with perspiration from the stress of extended combat, but his characteristic smile remained intact as he raised 3 fingers to indicate his victories in the engagement. "Holy Mother of God, Mr. Kepford," Kowalski breathed as he examined the battle damage covering the aircraft's wings and fuselage. "How did this thing stay in the air?" Dozens of bullet holes punctured the Corsair's aluminum skin, while several larger tears indicated hits from 20mm cannon shells that had failed to penetrate vital systems. Kepford's response reflected the casual professionalism that characterized the finest combat pilots. "She's a tough bird, Chief, tougher than anything the Japanese can build." But his hands shook slightly as he lit a cigarette, betraying the enormous stress of facing 20-to-1 odds and surviving through pure flying skill and mechanical reliability. Squadron Commander Blackburn arrived at the aircraft within minutes of Kepford's landing, his relief evident as he embraced his ace pilot and examined the damaged Corsair. The engagement would enter VF-17's official records as one of the most remarkable individual achievements in the squadron's distinguished combat history, but for Blackburn it represented something more personal. the survival of a friend and subordinate who had faced impossible odds and prevailed. "Jesus Christ, Ike," Blackburn said as he surveyed the bullet holes covering the aircraft. "When I heard that radio call, I thought we'd lost you for sure. 20 zeros, for crying out loud. How the hell did you get out of that?" Kepford's answer revealed the tactical thinking that separated ace pilots from merely competent aviators. "The war emergency power made the difference, Skipper. Once I got that extra boost, none of them could stay with me in a straight line. And their pilots got cautious after I knocked down a couple of them. They started thinking about going home instead of pressing the attack." The technical aspects of Kepford's escape fascinated the ground crews who maintained VF-17's aircraft. The water injection system that had saved his life represented cutting-edge aviation technology, automatically mixing water and methanol into the engine's fuel supply to prevent detonation and allow higher manifold pressures. Few pilots had been forced to use the system in actual combat, making Kepford's experience valuable data for future engagements. Ordnance man Ricci examined the machine gun ammunition counters, calculating how many rounds Kepford had fired during the engagement. "You used most of your ammo, Mr. Kepford. Must have been quite a fight up there." The precise ammunition expenditure provided insight into the intensity and duration of the aerial combat, suggesting that Kepford had been forced to take multiple firing opportunities against maneuvering targets. Executive Officer Hedrick interviewed Kepford extensively about the tactical details of his engagement, seeking lessons that could be applied to future combat operations. The Jolly Rogers had established their reputation through aggressive tactics and superior aircraft performance, but individual encounters like Kepford's solo fight provided valuable intelligence about Japanese capabilities and pilot quality. "Their formation discipline was excellent," Kepford reported during the formal debriefing. "They coordinated their attacks well and tried to use their numbers to box me in. But once I started knocking them down, they became more defensive. Japanese pilots are still skilled, but they're not as aggressive as they were 6 months ago." The observation aligned with broader intelligence assessments suggesting that Japanese pilot quality was declining as experienced aviators were lost faster than they could be replaced. The extended training programs that had produced Japan's early war aces were no longer feasible given the demands of combat operations and resource constraints imposed by Allied offensive campaigns. Radio operator Rodriguez filed detailed reports on the communication procedures used during the emergency, documenting how rapidly information had been transmitted throughout the operational area. The efficiency of American radio networks provided significant advantages over Japanese forces, who relied on more primitive communication systems that limited their ability to coordinate complex operations. As word of Kepford's remarkable escape spread throughout the base, support personnel who had never seen combat began to understand the daily risks faced by the pilots they served. Aviation mechanic Santos reflected on the responsibility of maintaining aircraft that carried men into such dangerous situations, knowing that mechanical failures could mean the difference between life and death in aerial combat. "Makes you think about every bolt and wire you touch," Santos confided to a fellow mechanic. "That airplane brought him home today, but it was shot full of holes. What if something we missed had failed up there?" The comment highlighted the intense pressure felt by ground crews who understood that their work directly affected pilot survival. Every pre-flight inspection, every maintenance procedure, every component replacement carried life or death implications that weighed heavily on conscientious technicians. Chief Sullivan organized a comprehensive inspection of Kepford's damaged Corsair, documenting every bullet hole and battle scar for intelligence analysis and aircraft improvement programs. The pattern of damage provided insights into Japanese gunnery techniques and ammunition effectiveness, while the Corsair's survival demonstrated the value of robust construction and protective systems. The psychological impact of Kepford's escape resonated throughout VF-17 and the broader Allied forces in the Solomons. Individual acts of heroism served important morale functions, demonstrating that American pilots and aircraft could overcome seemingly impossible odds through skill, determination, and technological superiority. The skull and crossbones insignia painted on Jolly Roger's aircraft had acquired almost mythical significance among both American and Japanese forces. Lieutenant Commander Blackburn recognized the propaganda value of Kepford's achievement and ensured that detailed accounts reached higher headquarters and war correspondents. The story of a single American pilot defeating 20 Japanese fighters would inspire Allied forces while demoralizing enemy units throughout the Pacific theater. "This is the kind of story that wins wars," Blackburn explained to his pilots. "Not just because of what I accomplished in the air, but because of what it represents. We have better aircraft, better training, and better support than anything the Japanese can field. When our guys understand that, they fight with confidence. When their guys understand it, they start looking for ways to avoid combat." The broader strategic implications of individual air battles like Kepford's encounter extended far beyond their immediate tactical results. Japanese commanders were becoming increasingly aware that their aviation forces could no longer compete on equal terms with American units, forcing them to adopt defensive strategies that ceded initiative to Allied forces. Intelligence reports reaching Allied headquarters documented declining Japanese pilot morale as word of American air superiority spread throughout enemy units. The psychological effects of repeated defeats in aerial combat created a downward spiral that affected all aspects of Japanese military operations, from individual pilot performance to high-level strategic planning. As evening fell over Piva Yoke airfield, ground crews worked by floodlights to prepare aircraft for the next day's operations. Kepford's damaged Corsair would require extensive repairs before returning to combat status, but other VF-17 fighters stood ready to continue the relentless offensive that was grinding down Japanese resistance throughout the Pacific. Mechanic Kowalski supervised the removal of Kepford's battle-damaged aircraft to the repair hangar, where specialists would spend days patching bullet holes and replacing damaged components. The work required precision and attention to detail that matched the demands of pre-war peacetime maintenance. But the urgency of combat operations compressed normal schedules into round-the-clock efforts. "We'll have her back in fighting condition within a week," Kowalski promised Kepford as they surveyed the extent of the damage. "That bird has a lot more fights left in her." The confident prediction reflected both professional pride and deep understanding of the Corsair's robust engineering that allowed extensive battle damage repair. Radio operator Rodriguez monitored late-night communications from other Allied units operating throughout the combat zone, tracking the progress of ongoing operations and maintaining situational awareness that would support the next day's mission planning. The complex web of radio networks that connected scattered Allied forces represented a significant technological advantage over Japanese communication systems. The February 19th engagement would be remembered as one of VF-17's most remarkable individual achievements, but it represented just one day in a sustained campaign that was gradually destroying Japanese aviation capability throughout the Pacific. Each mission, each combat engagement, each pilot victory contributed to the larger strategic objective of establishing complete Allied air superiority over Japanese forces. For the ground crews, radio operators, and support personnel who had witnessed Kepford's desperate fight and miraculous survival, the day provided lasting testimony to the effectiveness of American aircraft and the skill of the pilots who flew them. The Corsair had lived up to its fearsome reputation, bringing its pilot home despite facing impossible odds and absorbing battle damage that would have destroyed lesser aircraft. As Kepford made his way to the debriefing tent, he paused to look back at his bullet-riddled Corsair, its skull and crossbones insignia barely visible in the gathering darkness. Tomorrow would bring new missions, new dangers, and new opportunities to engage Japanese forces in aerial combat. But today had proven once again that American pilots and aircraft could prevail against any odds when skill, courage, and superior technology combined in the crucible of aerial warfare. The bent-wing fighter that had carried him through the most desperate aerial battle of his career would fight again, its battle scars repaired and its systems restored to peak efficiency by the dedicated ground crews who understood their vital role in maintaining Allied air superiority. The skull and crossbones painted on its nose would continue to strike fear into Japanese pilots throughout the Pacific, a symbol of American determination and technological supremacy that no enemy could match. In the months that followed, VF-17 would continue to accumulate an impressive record of aerial victories, establishing itself as the most successful Navy fighter squadron of World War II. But few individual engagements would match the drama and significance of Ira Kepford's solo battle against 20 Japanese fighters, a David and Goliath story that demonstrated the decisive advantages of American aviation technology and pilot training. The radioman who had monitored Kepford's desperate call for help, the mechanics who had prepared his aircraft, the ordnance men who had loaded his ammunition, and the countless support personnel who had made his mission possible all shared in the victory that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. Their collective efforts had created the conditions for individual heroism, proving that modern warfare required the coordinated efforts of entire teams rather than the actions of lone warriors. As the Pacific War continued its inexorable progression toward Japan's home islands, stories like Kepford's solo fight would inspire American forces while demoralizing enemy units throughout the theater. The psychological impact of such encounters often exceeded their immediate tactical significance, contributing to the broader campaign of attrition that was gradually destroying Japanese resistance. For the Japanese pilots who had witnessed the lone Corsair's escape from their carefully coordinated attack, the engagement represented a sobering reminder of changing tactical realities in the Pacific War. The aircraft they had once considered inferior were now demonstrating clear superiority in speed, firepower, and structural integrity, while American pilot training had reached levels that matched or exceeded Japanese standards. The technological gap between American and Japanese aviation would only widen as the war progressed, with advanced aircraft like the Corsair representing just the beginning of a production surge that would eventually deploy thousands of superior fighters throughout the Pacific. Each engagement like Kepford's solo battle provided additional evidence that Japanese aviation could no longer compete on equal terms with American forces. The skull and crossbones insignia that adorned VF-17's aircraft had become a symbol of American air superiority that Japanese pilots learned to fear and respect. The sight of those distinctive bent-wing silhouettes approaching through Pacific skies carried implications that extended far beyond individual air battles, representing the technological and industrial might of a nation committed to total victory. In the end, Ira Kepford's escape from 20 Japanese fighters on February 19, 1944, would be remembered as one of the most remarkable individual achievements in the history of aerial warfare. But for the American ground crews, radio operators, and support personnel who had made his mission possible, it represented something more, proof that their collective efforts could enable individual acts of heroism that would help win the war and bring their comrades home safely.